The declaration lasted barely a minute, yet its effect surged through the royal household like a shockwave. Standing before the senior members of the royal family, King Charles revealed that Princess Charlotte would become the first recipient of the Rose of Wales, a deeply private royal distinction established in Princess Diana's memory and reserved for the young woman considered most worthy of carrying forward her extraordinary compassion. Charlotte lowered her gaze, unable to hide her astonishment. Prince William struggled to contain his emotions, while across the room Queen Camilla's face grew noticeably tense. Before we explore what this extraordinary decision could mean for the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe so you never miss another royal update. Charlotte had arrived at the private family gathering believing she was simply there to observe preparations for future responsibilities. She remained seated beside Catherine while William stood near the king, completely unaware that every word Charles was about to deliver had been carefully prepared with Charlotte in mind. The Rose of Wales, a rare ceremonial honor established following Diana's passing to recognize exceptional courage, compassion, and dedication to service, had never before been presented to anyone. Charles had safeguarded it for years because he believed its first bearer needed to understand suffering without allowing it to define them. Then the monarch spoke with unmistakable clarity. Princess Charlotte would officially become the first individual entrusted with Diana's long-reserved royal honor. Her future responsibilities would include supporting grieving children, vulnerable families, and those who often felt forgotten by society. The distinction did not elevate her royal status. Instead, it placed upon her a lifelong commitment to service, and everyone present understood that commitment carried the enduring weight of Diana's name. Charlotte's first instinct was not to look toward the king. Instead, her eyes searched for her father. William recognized the silent question she was asking, yet found himself unable to answer. He quietly crossed the room, rested both hands gently on her shoulders, and for a brief, emotional moment the future king disappeared behind the role he carried. He became simply a son remembering his mother while witnessing his own daughter inherit the work Diana never had the chance to finish. Camilla remained seated. She had always believed the honor would exist only as a symbolic tribute because any attempt to revive it would inevitably invite comparisons with Diana. Her disbelief deepened when Charles explained that Charlotte would wear the silver rose insignia during major national ceremonies. Then the Queen noticed something even more troubling. Catherine already appeared familiar with every detail of the announcement. She had clearly been consulted beforehand. The decision had advanced far beyond private discussions without Camilla's knowledge. Charles carefully opened a slim velvet presentation case, revealing the silver insignia originally created in Diana's honor. Charlotte instinctively reached toward it before quietly pulling her hand back. At last, Camilla broke the silence, asking whether the king's decision was truly final. Charles met her gaze without hesitation. "It is completely final." After the gathering ended, the Queen immediately summoned her private secretary and instructed that every recommendation leading to the decision be reviewed. She wanted only one answer. Who had first suggested Charlotte's name before it reached the king? Although Camilla had witnessed the public announcement herself, she remained unaware of the private promises, hidden memories, and deeply personal loyalties that had ultimately placed Diana's honor into Charlotte's hands. For Charlotte, receiving the distinction was never about triumphing over anyone else. It felt instead like unexpectedly meeting a grandmother she had only ever known through stories, treasured photographs, and the quiet pauses that sometimes interrupted William whenever he spoke about his mother. For William, the honor represented both immense pride and the reopening of wounds he had spent years trying to heal. For Camilla, however, its meaning proved far more complicated. Diana's legacy no longer existed only within history books or public memory. It had now been formally woven into the future generation of the monarchy. Princess Charlotte had always possessed an unusual ability to notice the people everyone else overlooked. Catherine had raised her to believe royal service was never simply about titles, ceremonies, or standing in precisely the right place. It meant recognizing the individual left behind after everyone else had already moved on. That lesson suddenly carried greater significance than ever before because the Rose of Wales represented far more than an honorary title. It symbolized a lifelong responsibility directly connected to Diana's compassion and the charitable causes she had devoted herself to throughout her life. William had always spoken about his mother with great care. He shared stories with his children about Diana's humor, her private sadness, her remarkable courage, and the kindness she showed to people when no cameras or important figures were watching. He never wanted Charlotte to feel burdened by Diana's memory. Yet following the announcement, his daughter quietly turned to him and asked whether she truly deserved the responsibility Charles had entrusted to her. William remained silent for a long moment before answering. He confessed that for years he had feared Diana would slowly fade into little more than photographs, documentaries, and painful anniversaries remembered by fewer people each passing year. Then he gently explained to Charlotte that carrying another person's legacy was never about copying their life or inheriting their pain. It meant protecting the finest part of everything they began and carrying it forward into a brighter future. Meanwhile, Camilla returned alone to her private apartments without requesting assistance from any aide. She slowly removed her gloves and carefully placed them upon a nearby table. The Queen had spent years carving out her own respected position within the monarchy, yet this new honor reopened comparisons she had never truly managed to leave behind. Diana was no longer simply a figure from the past standing in history's shadow. Through Charlotte, she had become an official and living influence within the royal family once again. Later that evening, Catherine offered William a more personal explanation during a recorded family discussion preserved within the king's confidential household archive. Charlotte had once innocently asked why Diana continued helping complete strangers despite carrying so much sadness herself. That single question convinced Catherine her daughter already understood compassion as an act of sacrifice rather than a search for admiration. Charles had recognized that same quality. During hospital visits and confidential charity briefings, he repeatedly watched Charlotte remember people's names, ask what happened long after the cameras departed, and gently resist aides attempting to hurry her away from grieving families. That evening, Charlotte carefully placed the closed velvet presentation case beside a framed photograph of Diana. She quietly admitted to Catherine that she feared disappointing a grandmother she had never met in person. Yet Camilla was about to discover something even more unsettling. The proposal had not originally come from William or Catherine. The very first recommendation had been made by King Charles himself, forcing the Queen to confront the one individual she could neither dismiss nor openly challenge without placing everything she had built at risk. The story had not begun during a formal constitutional meeting or behind the doors of an official council chamber. Instead, it started 6 months earlier inside a children's grief center when a frightened young boy refused to speak with anyone accompanying the royal visit. Palace officials prepared to continue according to schedule. Charlotte chose otherwise. Quietly leaving the planned route, she sat several feet away from the boy and simply remained there in complete silence. The quiet exchange that followed became the private memory Charles could never forget and the defining moment that forever transformed the future of Diana's honor. Charlotte had attended the anniversary event believing she would simply accompany William and Catherine as an observer. The Diana Children's Bereavement Center existed to support children coping with the loss of a parent, and its connection to the late princess gave every visit profound emotional significance. For years Charles had carefully protected the Rose of Wales because he feared the wrong decision would reduce Diana's extraordinary compassion to little more than an empty ceremonial gesture. Then came Samuel. The 11-year-old overheard adults discussing his mother's death before suddenly turning toward the wall, shutting everyone out completely. He ignored the king's presence, politely refused Catherine's gentle invitation, and remained silent despite every effort made by the center's director. One palace aide quietly advised Charlotte to remain with the official group. She glanced toward William, noticed the hesitation in his expression, and made her own choice. Walking away from the scheduled procession, Charlotte quietly sat several feet away from Samuel. She never reached out to touch him. She never pressured him to speak. The young princess simply remained beside him in patient silence. William watched without saying a word, while Catherine discreetly stopped palace officials from interrupting or calling Charlotte back into the formal program. Charles remained close by, assuming the quiet exchange would last only a few moments. It didn't. After a long silence, Samuel finally looked toward Charlotte and softly asked whether she had ever missed someone she had never actually known. Her reply pierced through every layer of royal formality. She admitted that she missed her grandmother Diana through the sorrow she sometimes glimpsed in her father's eyes. William quietly lowered his head. Charles did the same, because in that instant the king realized his granddaughter had understood grief without trying to solve it or explain it away. Samuel slowly turned toward her and placed a small paper rose into Charlotte's hands. He had folded it himself for his late mother. Charlotte gently closed her fingers around the flower and promised his story would remain between them unless one day he chose to tell it himself. Charles recognized the same quiet restraint Diana had always shown whenever people trusted her with their deepest pain. Charlotte was not displaying kindness for attention. She was safeguarding someone else's vulnerability. Later that evening, Charles returned alone to his private study. Unlocking the drawer that held Diana's unused silver insignia, he carefully placed Samuel's paper rose beside it. For years the royal warrant, the official document authorizing the honor and defining its responsibilities, had remained untouched. The king slowly opened the document and carefully wrote Charlotte's name across the very first page. Yet the paper flower would not remain hidden forever. When Camilla later entered the study and noticed it resting beside Diana's silver insignia, she immediately understood Charles had made the decision entirely without her involvement. The choice had been born out of compassion. But inside that room, compassion was about to give way to confrontation. There were no courtiers standing nearby and no senior officials available to soften the conversation. Camilla walked into Charles's study carrying the briefing papers she had personally demanded, placed them beside the silver rose, and asked why his own wife had been excluded from a decision destined to reopen the most painful comparison either of them had spent years trying to escape. Charles made no effort to defend the secrecy. Instead, he quietly closed the study door. What followed was not a disagreement about royal procedure. It became a deeply personal confrontation over memory, regret, survival, and the one woman whose presence neither of them had ever truly left behind. By then, Camilla already knew how rapidly the decision had progressed. Charles had begun the formal process immediately after the visit to the grief center, informing only William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and 2 trusted senior legal advisors. The Rose of Wales belonged to Diana's humanitarian legacy, not to the authority of the reigning queen. And Charles believed Charlotte's bond with her grandmother had to remain protected from palace negotiations and political compromise. Camilla refused to accept that explanation. She asked Charles whether he truly understood what this ceremony would ultimately say about her place within the monarchy. To the public, Charlotte's appointment would appear to confirm that Diana remained the moral heart of the royal family, while the current queen continued to exist merely as someone history had reluctantly accepted. Years of loyalty, service, and unwavering commitment could be overshadowed by one small silver rose. Charles never looked away. He calmly replied that he would never diminish his granddaughter's future simply to shield grown adults from the discomfort of painful history. The monarchy had failed Diana during her lifetime, and he would not erase her influence after her death simply because that influence continued to make certain people uncomfortable. His words struck with unmistakable force because Camilla knew he was no longer speaking only as king. He was speaking as a man still burdened by remorse. Sliding the velvet presentation case across the desk, Camilla demanded that Charles postpone the investiture, the formal ceremony where Charlotte would receive the honor and officially accept its lifelong responsibilities. Charles rested his hand firmly upon the case before slowly drawing it back toward himself. Charlotte will not inherit our fear. The Queen then shifted her attention toward William. She accused the prince of using the honor to strengthen both Catherine's and Charlotte's standing within the royal family. Charles immediately rejected the accusation. Producing a documented private briefing, he revealed that William had originally requested additional time because he feared placing such an overwhelming emotional responsibility upon his daughter. Then Charles spoke the truth Camilla had never expected to hear. He alone had chosen Charlotte after witnessing her quiet encounter with Samuel. She had not attempted to imitate Diana. Without realizing anyone important was watching, she had demonstrated the very same courage naturally. Charles explained that this single moment had become the only reason that truly mattered. Camilla left the study without securing the delay she wanted, but she did not consider herself defeated. She now understood emotional appeals would never persuade Charles to reconsider. Her final opportunity rested within the royal warrant itself and the council responsible for approving Charlotte's permanent responsibilities. Charles may have ended their personal disagreement, but Camilla still believed the machinery of the monarchy could accomplish what persuasion could not. The Rose of Wales represented far more than a precious jewel or a private family tribute. Attached to the royal warrant were genuine responsibilities, future charitable patronages, ceremonial precedents, and a permanent place for Charlotte within the Crown's public mission. That made the final approval both immensely significant and politically sensitive. Camilla believed the council could quietly reduce the honor until it became little more than a harmless symbolic title. However, when the document reached Princess Anne, the Queen discovered something entirely unexpected. Charlotte's strongest supporter was not William. It was the monarchy's most uncompromising defender of duty. Before the council assembled, William stood alone reading once again a message Charlotte had quietly sent asking whether she had somehow caused problems for the family. He closed his eyes, steadied his breathing, and realized exactly what now hung in the balance. The Royal Council was the small body responsible for defining the limits of Charlotte's future responsibilities, while the royal warrant remained the legal document granting those responsibilities official ceremonial authority. If the wording inside that document was weakened, the honor would survive only in title while losing the very purpose for which it had been created. Camilla had already submitted her proposed amendment. She wanted the phrase guardian of Diana's compassionate legacy removed entirely and replaced with a far more neutral title of youth service representative. The Queen argued that the original wording transformed private family history into an ongoing public comparison. Charles listened carefully without interrupting, while Catherine quietly watched William's expression tighten. Everyone in the room recognized exactly what the amendment would accomplish. It would protect Camilla from future comparisons, but it would also remove Diana herself from the very honor established in her memory. Princess Anne carefully read the revised wording once. Then she read it again. Without saying a word, she laid down her pen and calmly asked whether the palace intended to honor Charlotte or simply continue hiding from Diana. Her question brought the entire room into complete silence. The Princess Royal had spent decades placing duty above personal comfort, and she refused to allow private fears to rewrite a promise intended for genuine public service. And then revealed evidence preserved inside an official note recorded within the royal archives. Not long before her death, Diana had privately spoken about the possibility of creating a future service honor. She insisted it should never be awarded to the most glamorous woman in the family. Instead, it should belong to the person capable of entering a room filled with pain and making frightened people feel truly seen. Charles slowly unfolded the original page. Beneath Diana's handwritten words remained his own handwritten acknowledgement, preserved exactly as he had written it years before. Camilla looked at the page in silence, and in that moment she finally realized the truth. The king had carried this unfinished promise within him for decades. Charlotte was not being elevated to strengthen William or Catherine's position. She had been chosen because Charles genuinely believed she was the one capable of fulfilling the vision Diana had once imagined. William cast his vote in favor of preserving the original wording. Catherine supported him without hesitation. Then the king gave his final approval, signing the royal warrant exactly as it stood, without altering a single line. Camilla accepted the decision in complete silence. The language remained unchanged. The honor retained all of its significance, and for the first time, the Queen could no longer conceal the disappointment she had fought to hide. The warrant had been sealed, but Camilla's response was about to transform a private family disagreement into a visible royal crisis. The first indication of that crisis was neither a public statement nor an open disagreement. It was an empty chair. During a private rehearsal for Charlotte's investiture, the seat reserved beside Charles for Queen Camilla remained vacant long after the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Charlotte noticed immediately. William pretended not to see it. Catherine quietly straightened her daughter's collar while members of the royal household waited in uneasy silence. Then a message arrived. The Queen would not be attending the rehearsal. No explanation accompanied the message, but no explanation was needed. Her absence spoke for itself. Charlotte had spent the entire morning rehearsing each stage of the ceremony. The investiture would mark the official moment she received the silver rose insignia and formally accepted every responsibility attached to it. She would respond to the King's declaration, greet representatives from several charitable organizations, and stand beside William and Catherine while Charles presented the honor as a symbol of unity within the royal family. Camilla, meanwhile, remained inside her private sitting room. Word had been sent that she was feeling unwell. In reality, she sat reading the final royal warrant over and over again. Each time her eyes reached the sentence connecting Charlotte directly to Diana's compassionate legacy, she stopped reading. Those words made the decision feel permanent. They also deepened her fear that the monarchy had finally placed Diana above everything she herself had spent years trying to build. Charlotte interpreted the Queen's absence as a personal rejection. Quietly, she told Catherine she would rather surrender the honor completely than become the cause of conflict between Charles and Camilla. Her mother answered without hesitation. Compassion, Catherine told her gently, should never require someone to disappear. If you give up this responsibility because another person feels threatened, then this honor will end up teaching the opposite of everything Diana believed in. Charles received Camilla's message without saying a single word. He folded it once, slipped it beneath his briefing papers, and calmly continued the rehearsal. His silence unsettled William more than any display of anger ever could. The prince understood that when the king became quiet, it usually meant his decision had become impossible to change. Later that day, a senior palace aide privately warned Camilla through a recorded briefing that refusing to attend the actual investiture would transform an internal family disagreement into a national controversy. The public would never witness the private emotions behind her decision. Instead, they would simply see a queen refusing to stand beside a young princess receiving an honor dedicated to compassion. Camilla understood how quickly disappointment could be interpreted as cruelty. William then approached Charles and quietly suggested postponing the ceremony for Charlotte's sake. The king refused. Delaying the investiture, he explained, would teach his granddaughter that another person's discomfort carried greater importance than her own duty. Before anyone could persuade her otherwise, Charlotte made a decision of her own. She requested a private meeting with Camilla. No Charles. No William. No Catherine. No aides. No protocol. The adults had already fought their battle through legal warrants, council meetings, and decades-old wounds. Everything was about to change when Charlotte quietly walked into the Queen's private sitting room entirely alone. Charlotte entered carrying neither the silver rose insignia nor a prepared speech. She came without her parents and without any formal script. Camilla expected the young princess either to defend the honor or ask for her approval. Instead, Charlotte quietly placed Samuel's folded paper flower onto the table between them and apologized for the pain the decision had caused. The simplicity of her words caught the Queen completely off guard. For the very first time since Charles's announcement, Diana's legacy was no longer being argued over as history. Instead, it had become one frightened child asking another woman not to feel forgotten. Charlotte had requested the meeting only after discovering Camilla was considering missing the investiture altogether. Charles had hesitated, believing the emotional burden was too great for his daughter. Catherine disagreed. She insisted Charlotte should be allowed to speak honestly, in her own voice. The investiture remained the formal occasion where the princess would receive the insignia and publicly accept every duty attached to Diana's honor. Yet the conversation taking place inside that private room carried even greater significance than the ceremony itself. Camilla remained seated in silence while Charlotte continued standing before her. There were no advisors waiting nearby. No parents ready to intervene. No officials to guide the discussion. After several quiet moments, the Queen finally gestured toward the chair opposite her. Charlotte sat carefully, keeping both hands folded together as though one careless movement might shatter the fragile calm that still remained. She admitted she feared the honor would once again turn Diana and Camilla into rivals. She never wanted her grandmother's memory to become a weapon used against the Queen, or against anyone else within the family. Her words were simple, yet they forced Camilla to confront something she had spent years avoiding. The child sitting across from her had never asked to win. She had only asked for peace. Camilla answered during a private recorded conversation that was later preserved inside the royal family archive. She confessed the distinction had reopened years of judgment she believed she had finally survived. A person, she admitted, could accept history and still feel wounded when it unexpectedly returned. Charlotte listened carefully without interrupting. When the Queen had finished speaking, Charlotte gently pushed Samuel's paper rose across the table. She explained what Samuel had told her about grief and why the little paper flower meant so much. Camilla reached out and touched one folded edge before quietly asking why Charlotte had chosen to come alone. The princess answered softly, "Because this is about how you feel, not about what everyone else thinks." Then Charlotte revealed something even Charles had not expected. She had already asked the king to include a new pledge within the investiture ceremony itself. The honor, she said, would exist to serve living people rather than preserve old divisions. Those words changed everything. Camilla slowly returned Samuel's paper rose to Charlotte and told her to carry it beside Diana's silver insignia during the ceremony. She promised she would attend. Not because the past had stopped hurting, but because Charlotte should never be punished for carrying forward its finest lesson. The conflict had quietly changed behind closed palace doors. But when those same doors opened the following morning, the true meaning of everything that had happened would be judged beneath the eyes of an entire nation. By sunrise, the story had already escaped beyond the palace walls. Crowds gathered outside St. James's Palace carrying white roses, handwritten notes, and treasured photographs of Diana walking beside a young Prince William. Television networks abandoned their planned programming. Newspaper presses rushed out special editions. Yet before the ceremony had even begun, one single image came to define the entire day. Princess Charlotte stepping from the royal car alongside Queen Camilla. For just a brief moment, the Queen rested her hand gently behind Charlotte's back as they entered the palace together. The palace had officially confirmed that Charlotte would receive the Rose of Wales before representatives from children's charities, bereavement organizations, and shelters connected to Diana's lifelong humanitarian work. The honor created an official ceremonial bond between grandmother and granddaughter, transforming a private family memory into a lasting public promise of service. That was why the occasion carried such extraordinary significance. It was never simply about inheritance. It was about the values the monarchy had chosen to carry into its future. The crowd understood that immediately. The fictional London Chronicle published a front page showing Charlotte holding Samuel's folded paper flower beneath the headline, "Diana's Rose Blooms Once Again." Copies of the newspaper rose above the crowd gathered outside St. James's Palace as the palace bells echoed across the city. Broadcasters described the investiture as the strongest acknowledgement of Diana's moral influence the monarchy had made in an entire generation. Camilla, however, still faced public skepticism. Commentators questioned whether her decision to appear beside Charlotte reflected genuine support or whether she had simply bowed to growing public pressure. Those doubts disappeared before the ceremony even officially began. The Queen quietly stepped toward Charlotte and personally adjusted the ribbon attached to the silver rose insignia. Charlotte looked up. Camilla answered with nothing more than a small, reassuring nod. In that single gesture, the atmosphere surrounding both women quietly changed. William watched the moment unfold before gently turning away. Within seconds, he found himself witnessing something he had never imagined possible. His mother's memory, his daughter's future, and the current queen, sharing the same moment without resentment. Pride met grief. For years, Diana's name had carried division throughout the royal family. Now Charlotte carried that same name without carrying anger. Then Charles departed completely from the prepared speech lying before him. Looking directly toward his granddaughter, the king declared that Charlotte was not receiving the Rose of Wales simply because she had been born into the royal family. She was receiving it because she had listened when everyone else had already begun walking away. Those unscripted words, later preserved within the official ceremony transcript, transformed the occasion from a traditional royal event into something deeply personal. Charlotte then delivered the special pledge she had personally requested. She promised that the Rose of Wales would never become an instrument for reopening old divisions. Instead, it would exist to recognize suffering, restore dignity, and remind forgotten people that they were still seen. Queen Camilla became the very first senior member of the royal family to applaud. William followed. Then Charles. Within moments, the entire room rose to its feet behind them. The nation had already delivered its judgment. But the true meaning of the honor would only become clear later that evening, when the palace doors closed and Charles, Camilla, William, and Charlotte quietly reflected on everything that had changed between them. That night, the silver rose no longer symbolized a rivalry between a beloved princess who had passed away and a queen still living. Instead, it rested quietly beside Samuel's carefully folded paper flower. 2 generations of grief. 1 unexpected act of understanding. Charles had finally fulfilled a promise he had carried within his heart for decades. William had watched his daughter inherit responsibility without inheriting bitterness. Camilla had confronted the shadow she feared most and ultimately chosen not to battle the child standing beneath it. And Charlotte had transformed remembrance into something the monarchy could finally embrace. Mercy. Following the ceremony, Charles invited William, Charlotte, and Camilla into his private sitting room. Catherine remained close by, but but she deliberately allowed the 4 people most deeply affected by the decision to speak together without an audience. The king confirmed that the Rose of Wales would always remain a distinction based on service rather than royal status. Charlotte's responsibilities would be introduced gradually, allowing the role to shape her future without taking away her childhood. William quietly thanked his father for protecting Diana's legacy of compassion. He admitted he had feared the ceremony might once again turn his mother's memory into another source of conflict inside the royal family. Charles acknowledged that the palace had allowed those divisions to linger for far too many years. Memory, he admitted, had been treated like a danger when it should always have been embraced as a lesson. Camilla then turned directly toward Charlotte. The Queen explained that the king's announcement had overwhelmed her because it had suddenly reopened years of judgment she believed she had finally left behind. She made one thing perfectly clear. None of that pain had ever been Charlotte's responsibility. Then she made an unexpected request. She asked if she could accompany Charlotte during one of her first official charity visits. Not as someone competing with Diana's legacy, but as someone willing to help preserve it. Charlotte quietly opened the velvet presentation case and removed the silver rose insignia. Then she carefully placed Samuel's folded paper flower beside it. Closing the lid, she handed the case back to Charles. "One represents duty," she said softly. "The other reminds us why duty matters." Charles later recorded those words within a documented family declaration preserved inside the royal archive. From that day forward, every future recipient of the Rose of Wales would keep a personal reminder of someone whose suffering had shaped their commitment to service. The new tradition would ensure compassion could never become an empty ceremony. Camilla's support finally brought every remaining resistance to an end. William accepted the completed warrant without hesitation. Catherine began gently preparing Charlotte for the responsibilities that awaited her in the years ahead. And for the first time, the monarchy fully embraced Diana's legacy as a living part of its future rather than a painful chapter best left unopened. Charlotte had neither replaced Diana nor triumphed over Camilla. Instead, she had shown that compassion could be passed from one generation to the next without carrying hatred along with it. The silver rose had begun as an unfinished promise. In Charlotte's hands, it became something whole. A royal legacy defined no longer by loss, but by healing. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another royal family update. We'll see you in the next video.